The photograph looked ordinary at first. A well-dressed black family standing proudly outside an ornate gate in 1948. Their smiles were warm, their posture confident, their clothes immaculate. Yet hidden within that still image was a truth that history had tried to bury. A truth that would stop one researcher cold nearly 80 years later. Inside the climate-controlled archive room of the Atlanta History Center, Margaret Hayes stood surrounded by silence. A faint hum from the air vents was the only sound as she held the photograph carefully between her gloved hands. For 15 years, she had studied images from the civil rights era, documenting pain, progress, and quiet defiance. But this photograph felt different. It carried something unspoken, something she could not name at first glance. She examined it closely. The father's fedora tilted with quiet pride. The mother's white gloves gleamed against her dark coat. Their children, two small faces full of unguarded joy, smiled as if unaware of the world's boundaries. At first, Margaret thought it was just another family portrait, pleasant, ordinary, like hundreds she cataloged each week. Yet something deep within her refused to let it go. Experience had trained her eyes to notice what others missed, the quiet messages hidden in the corners of history. Sometimes it was a reflection in a window, a name on a storefront, or a sign in the distance. And in this photograph, something felt buried in plain sight. After lunch, she returned to her desk, drawn back to the image like a thread she could not stop pulling. The afternoon sun had shifted, cutting through the blinds and striking the photograph at a new angle. She lowered the magnifying glass, and as the light sharpened, so did the truth. Behind the family, half concealed by the branch of an oak tree, a weathered metal sign stood at the gate. Margaret leaned closer, breath held, her pulse echoing in her ears. The words, though faded, were clear enough to sting. Whites only. City Ordinance. 1923. For a moment, she did not move. The air in the archive felt heavier. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her digital camera, capturing every angle, every shadow. This was no longer just a family portrait. It was evidence. It was testimony. It was defiance, frozen in time. Margaret leaned back in her chair, mind racing. Who were they? This family that had stood smiling before a gate that barred their entry. Why there? Why then? And what had become of them? Had they lived long enough to see the world begin to change? She steadied herself and began photographing the image under shifting light, each frame revealing another detail. The ironwork of the gate, twisting vines and magnolia blossoms forged in steel, hinted at a location she could trace. The ordinance number gave her a path to follow. She uploaded the high-resolution files to her computer, her eyes moving with focus and precision. This was how truth resurfaced. Not through headlines or speeches, but through a single moment captured on film, waiting for someone patient enough to see what history had tried to hide. The segregation ordinance number 1923 gave her a crucial starting point for her research. Within an hour of intense searching through digital archives, she had identified the location, Piedmont Park's eastern entrance, which had been redesigned and upgraded in 1935 as part of a Depression-era public works project. The ornate gates matched archival photographs from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution's extensive collection. Margaret pulled up city directories from 1948, searching for African-American families who lived near the park boundaries. The list was surprisingly long. Despite the harsh segregation laws, many black families had established homes in the surrounding neighborhoods, though they couldn't access the park's amenities, playgrounds, or green spaces that were so close to their daily lives. She contacted her colleague, Dr. Robert Chen, a historian specializing in Jim Crow Atlanta and its legal apparatus. "Robert, I need you to see something immediately," she said into her phone, unable to contain the excitement and urgency in her voice. Within 20 minutes, he was standing beside her desk in the archive room, studying the photograph through the magnifying glass with the careful attention of a trained historian. "This is deliberate," Robert said quietly, tracing the composition with his finger, hovering carefully above the delicate image without touching it. "Look at how they're positioned. The gate is clearly visible in the frame. The sign is partially shown, but readable. The family is centered perfectly. This wasn't accidental or casual snapshot." He straightened up, meeting Margaret's eyes with growing excitement. Someone wanted to document this specific moment, this specific exclusion. The question is why? What were they trying to preserve? Margaret nodded, her mind already racing ahead. "I'm thinking this might not be an isolated photograph. What if there are more? What if this was part of something larger?" Margaret spent the next 3 days systematically combing through the History Center's uncatalogued collections, working late into the evenings when the building was quiet and empty. The photograph had been part of a donated estate acquired 6 months earlier from a deceased woman named Dorothy Patterson. The donation records were frustratingly sparse. Just basic information about boxes of miscellaneous items, family papers, and photographs that hadn't yet been properly inventoried, cataloged, or preserved according to archival standards. She formally requested access to the entire Patterson donation. 2 archivists wheeled out 3 large archival boxes on a cart, each one labeled with temporary identification numbers. Margaret's heart raced with anticipation as she carefully opened the first one, not knowing what she might discover. Inside were letters, receipts, church programs, school reports, and various ephemera spanning several decades. The second box contained more photographs. Birthday parties, weddings, church gatherings, school graduations, normal family memories, precious but seemingly ordinary. The third box was different, fundamentally different. Wrapped carefully in acid-free tissue paper were 43 photographs, each one meticulously preserved in individual glass sign envelopes with archival quality materials. Margaret's hand shook as she laid them out on the large archive table in careful rows. Each photograph showed the same family, the father, mother, and two children posed in front of different locations around Atlanta, a movie theater with a prominently colored entrance rear sign directing black patrons to a separate door, a drinking fountain marked white with a smaller, poorly maintained fountain labeled colored beside it, a pristine public library with a separate, notably smaller building behind it for black residents. Every photograph was dated on the back in careful, precise handwriting. July 1946, September 1947, March 1948. Each location was meticulously noted. Fox Theater, Courthouse Square, Carnegie Library, and each included a brief, heartbreaking notation: where we cannot go, where Sarah cannot drink, and where James cannot read. Margaret sat down heavily in her chair. This wasn't just a collection of family photographs. This was a systematic, deliberate documentation of segregation created by an ordinary family who somehow understood that someday someone would need to see the truth. They had lived. Margaret needed to know more about Dorothy Patterson and her connection to the family in the photographs. The donation papers listed her last known address, a modest single-story house in the West End neighborhood, a historically black area of Atlanta. Margaret drove there on a cool October morning. The autumn air was crisp and clear, hoping to find neighbors who might have known Dorothy or remembered her. The house stood empty and neglected, a faded "for sale" sign planted in the overgrown front yard. Paint peeled from the wooden siding, and the porch sagged slightly. Margaret felt a pang of sadness looking at it. She knocked on the door of the neighboring house, a well-maintained home with flower boxes in the windows. An elderly woman answered, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, wearing a floral apron. "Can I help you, dear?" "Well, I'm Margaret Hayes from the Atlanta History Center. I'm researching a collection of photographs that were donated by Dorothy Patterson, who I believe lived next door. Did you know her?" Margaret asked hopefully. The woman's weathered face softened immediately with recognition and fondness. "Dorothy? Oh, yes, she was my neighbor for 30 years. Sweet woman, quiet and dignified. Passed away last spring after a brief illness. She introduced herself as Mrs. Eleanor Gibson and opened the door wider. Would you like to come in? I have some time, and I'd be happy to talk about Dorothy. She was a good friend." Over coffee, in Eleanor's warm kitchen, filled with the comforting aroma of fresh bread, Margaret began to uncover the story behind the woman whose photographs had captured her imagination. Dorothy, Eleanor explained, had been a retired schoolteacher, quiet, disciplined, and deeply private. For 40 years, she had taught generations of Atlanta's children through both segregation and integration. She had never married, never had children of her own, but she carried a quiet pride in her family's past, a past she believed held meaning beyond her lifetime. But Dorothy often spoke of her aunt and uncle, Eleanor said softly, stirring sugar into her cup. Said they were brave in their own way, that they did something important, something people should never forget. Margaret leaned forward, her pen frozen above her notepad. "Do you remember their names?" Eleanor paused, eyes distant, lost in thought. "Sarah and James," she said finally. Sarah was Dorothy's aunt, her father's sister. Dorothy said they had done something courageous during the segregation years, something history had overlooked. In her last months, she became determined to put everything in order. She told me, the story must be told before it disappears. Margaret felt a wave of emotion tighten her throat. Dorothy had understood exactly what she was preserving. She had known the weight of memory, the quiet defiance hidden in her family's photographs, and she had ensured that someone would one day uncover the truth. Back at the archive, later that afternoon, Margaret worked with renewed purpose. She sifted through Dorothy's papers, page after page, until a single manila envelope caught her attention at the bottom of the last box. Inside was a family tree, drawn in Dorothy's precise handwriting. At the top were two names, Sarah Mitchell, born 1918, and James Mitchell, born 1915. Beneath them, two children, Ruth Mitchell, born 1940, and Thomas Mitchell, born 1943. Margaret's research deepened over the following days. She found James Mitchell's name listed in the 1948 Atlanta City Directory. His occupation, porter, terminal station. A demanding job of long hours and little pay. Sarah's name did not appear, an absence that spoke volumes. Women like her, who worked as domestics or stayed home to raise their children, were often invisible in official records. Then Margaret found Ruth Mitchell's obituary, dated 2003. Ruth had passed away at 63, survived by two daughters, Patricia Collins and Dorothy Patterson. Margaret froze. Dorothy was not a distant researcher. She was family. Sarah and James were her grandparents. The photographs that had stopped Margaret cold were Dorothy's inheritance, a legacy of courage preserved for someone who would understand. As Margaret turned through Dorothy's final papers, she discovered a thin letter folded carefully inside a plastic sleeve. Its typewriter ink had faded, but the words remained clear. It was written by Sarah Mitchell to her daughter Ruth in 1968. shortly after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., a letter born from grief, strength, and unshaken hope. It began simply, "My dear Ruth." Sarah's voice, formal yet tender, reaching out from the past, ready to tell her truth. In these dark days, as our city and our nation grieve, I find my thoughts returning to the photographs your father and I took 20 years ago. You were just a little girl then, only 8, and Tommy was 5. Full of laughter, unaware of the world's cruelties. You once asked me why we dressed in our Sunday best to stand outside places we could not enter. Why we smiled in front of signs that told us we were not wanted. Why we brought you along to witness what most parents tried to hide from their children. I want you to understand now, words can be dismissed as bitterness. Memories can fade. Stories can be denied by those who do not wish to believe them. But photographs do not lie. They bear witness when voices are silenced. They speak when the world refuses to listen. Your father and I wanted to create proof, not for the present, but for the future. For you, for your daughters. For anyone who might one day say, it was not that bad. We wanted them to see the truth with their own eyes. To understand what dignity looked like when it stood against exclusion. To know that even when the world turned its back on us, we stood tall before it. Photographs outlast us, Ruth. They hold what time tries to erase. Sarah, Mitchell, Margaret read those words again and again, the paper trembling slightly in her hands. Tears blurred her vision. Now she understood. The Mitchell family had not simply taken pictures. They had built a quiet monument to truth. She and Robert threw themselves into researching whether Sarah and James's photographic project stood alone in the vast landscape of civil rights documentation. They discovered that while many African Americans had photographed segregation, few had done so with such deliberate precision, and even fewer with the intention of leaving a message for the generations to come. Gordon Parks captured the same era, Robert said one night, surrounded by stacks of books and scanned negatives. But he was a professional. He had platforms, publishers, an audience. Sarah and James were ordinary people. They worked in silence, knowing they might never be seen. Margaret nodded, her voice quiet. They were historians before the world recognized them as such. The deeper they dug, the more the risks became clear. Records show that James Mitchell had once been questioned by police in 1949 for photographing the colored waiting room at Terminal Station, the very place he worked every day. The police report, written in casual bureaucratic tone, read, "Colored male taking pictures." Claimed it was for family keepsakes. Warned not to cause trouble. Margaret stared at the words, her stomach tightening. The report's calm language barely concealed the menace beneath it. James had taken those photographs at great personal risk, defying a system designed to keep him unseen. Letters in Dorothy's collection revealed even more. Sarah had been dismissed from her job as a domestic worker in 1948 after her employer discovered she was photographing segregated facilities across Atlanta. "I will not have someone working in my home trying to stir up trouble," the employer had said. Sarah's handwritten letter to her sister told the rest. 3 long months of unemployment, growing bills, and nights spent reassuring her children that everything would be fine. Yet still, she and James kept taking photographs. Each click of the shutter was defiance. Each image, an act of quiet rebellion. Each frame, a declaration that they existed, and that history would remember them. The photographs had not only captured history, they had cost the Mitchell family dearly. Through months of research, Margaret finally traced Patricia Collins, the surviving daughter of Ruth and sister of Dorothy. Now 78, Patricia lived in a quiet retirement community in Decatur, just outside Atlanta. Her voice over the phone was warm and steady, but when Margaret explained the purpose of her research, it carried an unmistakable spark, pride mixed with reverence. They agreed to meet that coming Saturday. When Margaret arrived, Patricia welcomed her into a sunlit apartment filled with the echoes of a life well lived. Every wall, every shelf carried a photograph. Weddings, graduations, birthdays, generations of faces smiling back through time. "I remember them very well," Patricia said softly, pointing toward a framed portrait resting on a nearby table. It showed Sarah and James in their later years. The lines on their faces deepened, but their eyes still strong, still watchful. Grandma Sarah was quiet but commanding. She never needed to raise her voice. Dignity followed her like a shadow. And Grandpa James, he was always thinking, always watching. "My mother used to say he noticed things other people didn't." Patricia paused, her gaze drifting to a memory. Grandma kept those photographs in a wooden trunk, locked with a little brass key she wore around her neck. When we visited, she'd open it slowly, like she was revealing sacred things. She'd lay each photograph on the bed and tell us stories. Her voice trembled slightly as she recalled the words. "This is the Fox Theater," Sarah would say. "Your mother could not watch a movie here with white children. This is the library where I was told I could not read. This is the restaurant where your grandfather served food every day, but was never allowed to sit and eat." She wanted us to remember, Patricia said. Well, not with anger, but with truth. Margaret leaned forward, her notebook forgotten. Did they ever speak about why they took them? Why they risked so much? Patricia nodded, eyes distant as though hearing her grandfather's voice again. "He told me once, when I was about 12. The people who write the history books might forget. They might soften it. But these photographs will not lie. They show exactly what we faced. She smiled faintly. He made me promise to keep them safe. He said, one day someone will need to see. The promise had crossed 3 generations. And now, Margaret realized, she was the one fulfilling it. Over the next 3 months, Margaret worked tirelessly to create an exhibition at the Atlanta History Center. She titled it, Bearing Witness, The Mitchell Family's Record of Segregation, 1946-1950. She collaborated closely with Patricia and the surviving family members, ensuring that every caption, every placement, every light angle honored their truth. The opening night glowed with quiet electricity. Hundreds filled the gallery. Historians, teachers, civil rights veterans, and families who had lived through the same painful years. Along the walls, the photographs told the story of a family's defiance, image after image arranged chronologically, each paired with Sarah's handwritten notes enlarged beside them. Where we cannot go, where Sarah cannot drink, where James cannot sit. At the center of the exhibition hung the photograph that had started it all. The Mitchell family standing outside Piedmont Park's iron gates. Beside it, Sarah's 1968 letter to her daughter Ruth, the letter that gave meaning to every image. When Patricia stepped to the podium, the room fell silent. Her voice, steady but full of emotion, carried through the gallery. My grandparents did not think of themselves as heroes, she began. They were ordinary people who refused to let injustice define them. They wore their finest clothes because they wanted to show that dignity does not ask permission. They smiled in those photographs, not because life was easy, but because they would not let segregation steal their humanity. For a long moment after she finished, no one spoke. Then the room erupted in quiet applause, the kind that comes not from excitement, but from reverence. Within days, the exhibition became the talk of Atlanta. Local news stations covered it, then national outlets followed. Universities, museums, and historians across the country began referencing the Mitchell collection as one of the most significant personal archives of the segregation era. Unlike the photojournalists and activists whose work defined that period, Sarah and James had done it alone. 2 ordinary people who saw injustice and decided that silence was no longer an option. And through their photographs, they ensured that history would never again be allowed to forget. A black family, quietly, methodically, had documented their own exclusion. Year after year, they turned pain into proof, turning every shutter click into a shield against forgetting. It wasn't done for sympathy. It was done for history. For truth. For the generations who might one day look back and wonder what it truly meant to endure. The city of Atlanta would come to honor that act of courage. The council passed a unanimous resolution, recognizing Sarah and James Mitchell, not just as photographers, but as guardians of memory, as silent architects of truth. 6 months after the exhibition had stunned the nation, Margaret found herself once more standing before the same iron gates of Piedmont Park. But this time, she wasn't alone. Beside her stood Patricia Collins, Ruth's daughter, and with her, generations of descendants who had never known the full story until now. The great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren of Sarah and James gathered in the very place their ancestors had once been denied entry. The park was alive that morning, children laughing, families of every background walking freely through the gates once closed to people like the Mitchells. The air carried both peace and justice. Before them, a new bronze marker gleamed beneath the sun. It read, "Here, in 1948, Sarah and James Mitchell photographed their family outside gates they could not enter due to segregation laws. Their systematic documentation of 43 segregated sites in Atlanta between 1946 and 1950 stands as a lasting record of both injustice and dignity. Their courage ensures that future generations will remember and understand." Patricia's hands trembled slightly as she laid a bouquet of fresh flowers at its base. Her voice, soft but steady, carried the weight of generations. "They would be amazed by all this," she said. "They never wanted fame. They just wanted truth, preserved, not forgotten. They wanted us to understand what they survived and what it cost them to stay human." Margaret had arranged for all 43 photographs to be digitized and permanently housed in the Library of Congress, available freely to anyone, anywhere in the world. Now, students, historians, and ordinary people could see what the Mitchells saw and feel what they felt. Several universities had already integrated the collection into their civil rights and photography curricula, ensuring the Mitchell family's lens would continue to educate long after their time. As the ceremony drew to an end and the crowd slowly dispersed, Margaret lingered by the marker, her gaze steady and reverent. She thought of Dorothy Patterson, who, in her final days, had so carefully organized these images so they wouldn't fade into obscurity. She thought of Ruth and Thomas, who protected their parents' legacy with quiet strength. But, most of all, she thought of Sarah and James, 2 ordinary people who had dared to believe that dignity itself was worth documenting. Their story had begun in silence behind locked gates, and now it would echo endlessly in the open air of a free park.